I do not know if I'm going to be able to convey what it is that I want to convey, but I promise you I'm going to try. Do you have a friend or a loved one with whom you can just be? If all the things that he or she offers to you slipped away one by one until all that was left was just the two of you, with no thing left to give or receive, would you stay? Could it be okay if there was nothing in it for you, no services rendered, just could you just be? If there was only the invisible secret of your love for one another binding you together, could it be okay? Hold on to that question. In the early days, for followers of Jesus, there was always something in it for the crowds. They got something. Very first miracle in John's gospel, they got wine. Y'all remember this story? Huh? No, they were invited to a wedding. Just some random people invited to a wedding. Happens Jesus was there. They ran out of wine. My man turned water into wine. It was not only wine, but it was the best wine most of them had ever had in their entire lives. Where'd this wine come from? Everybody pointed to Jesus, and a whole bunch of people believed and started following Jesus because of the wine. There was something in it for them. There was something. Are you with me? Why do y'all hang out with Jesus? The wine, I mean, it's insane. This is not wine, by the way. It's water. There was something in it for them. Right after that, that's at the very beginning. Right after that, like right on top of it, Jesus healed their sick. First, there was a little boy, an official in the city in which he was, brought him his little boy, and the little boy was sick, and Jesus healed him. Then word got out, there's great health care if you follow this guy. There was something in it for him, so they brought their sick more and more to Jesus, and he healed them. He healed them all, people whom no doctor could help. And a bunch of people believed and started following Jesus because of the healings. There was something in it for them. Right after that, I mean, this is bam, 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 right at the beginning of John's gospel. A whole bunch of people are following Jesus because of the wine and the health care. And they show up one sunny afternoon on a grassy hillside. He does a lot of teaching. Then it's lunchtime, and nobody remembered to pack a lunch. And so Jesus feeds 5,000 of them. And it's the best meal they've ever had. And everybody's talking about it. And a whole bunch of people believed and started following Jesus. Because every time you saw this guy, every time you were around this cat, there was something in it for you, something. Which is great. It's a great way to start. It might be the only way to begin. We get to this morning's gospel. This is right after the feeding of the 5,000 and the wine and the health care. And the people come to Jesus, a great big crowd come to him for more food. Oh, he knows what they're after. They want more bread and more fish. And he tells them the kitchen is closed. Then he says, there's no thing. There's nothing. There's no thing here but me. I am the bread. That's what he says to him. I am the bread of life. And it strikes me that when he said, I've always found that, by the way, it's a challenging teaching. What does that mean, Jesus? I am the bread. But it strikes me, like this go round with it, it strikes me that Jesus is asking us a question when he says, I am the bread. And the question is, would you be here? Would you be here with me if there was no thing, if there was nothing in it for you, no thing except my love? Would you stick around if it was just the two of us, bound together by the secret of God's invisible love? And this question caused me to think of a man named John. Now, John Alvarez was born in Spain in 1542. Are we together? We're going back in time. 1542. John's father died when he was a 2-year-old little boy, and John's mother, a weaver by trade, was therefore left destitute to raise John and his 2 older brothers on her own. From an early age, John knew all about tragedy and loss, which made him naturally compassionate and gave him a special gift with the sick and the sorrowful. In fact, when he was 12 years old, in order to make money for his impoverished family, John got work at a hospital in his town, caring for the sick and the dying, folks who had incurable infectious diseases, the plague. The man in charge of the hospital was a kindly Dominican priest, and he saw something of promise in John and encouraged John to study himself for the priesthood, which John did, eventually becoming a monk in a Carmelite order. When he entered the monastery, John took the name Juan de la Cruz, John of the Cross. John was a small man. His growth seems to have been limited by his malnourishment and impoverished childhood. He was 4 foot 11 inches tall. He was thin as a rail. He had big brown eyes and a heart as large as all the outdoors. John of the Cross lived in a time when the church had drifted off course. Religious life had become overly complex and riddled with abuses of purpose and power. And John, who was no stranger to tragedy and poverty, longed for a return to following Jesus simply, silently, and in a way that was marked by service to others. And so he became involved in the reform movements of the day. Now, I'm sure you know this. People in power do not like change. So John's involvement in the Reformation movements quickly made him many enemies, to the extent that one night when John was asleep in his cell, as it were, little room in the monastery, a mob of monks and lay people and armed officials kidnapped John from his bed. They took him in the night to another monastery some distance from his own, and they imprisoned him in a small prison cell, which was formerly used as a latrine. Even small as John was in stature, he could barely move around in this little prison cell. They kept John locked up for 9 months, taking him out only to beat him and shout demands that he renounce his Reformation work. One night, many said by a miracle, John escaped through a small high window, and though emaciated and nearly dead, he managed to get himself to a convent founded by his dear friend, St. Teresa of Avila. As the story goes, when John climbed down from the window, his feet hit the floor, and weak as he was from his imprisonment, he was very disoriented, did not know which way to go. But a dog came out of the dark woods, and John followed the dog to Teresa's convent, where the nuns took him in and nursed him back to health in secret. John of the Cross, our Juan de la Cruz, went on to live many years after that, writing and teaching about a relationship with God that is not characterized by things, whether wine, healing, free lunch, or even freedom, but rather a relationship with God that is characterized by the intimacy that emerges when it's just the two. Just you and Jesus with no thing passing between you but God's secret love. John, over the years, became increasingly known for his gentleness, his spiritual wisdom, and the wideness of his compassionate heart. Even when John of the Cross became well known, he paid special attention to the poor and the sick. It's a well-worn story that when John was walking through the streets and he saw little children who didn't have access to school, he would stop, camp out with them, and teach them to read and to write. And when he found people in the streets who were hungry, he would go to people who had means and beg them alms so that he could buy food for the poor. At the end of his life, John of the Cross became very ill with an infection in his leg. And when it became clear that he was going to die, the superior, his head guy, as it were, in the monastery in which he was staying, gave him a choice of where to go for his last days, for what we would now refer to as hospice care. John, the superior, told him could go to a convent that Teresa of Avila had founded, where John was well known and immensely well loved and would be very comfortable as he eased out of this life into the next. Or the superior said John could go to a monastery some distance away where no one knew him and where the superior had a reputation for being selfish, mean, and rigid. Remarkably and unhesitatingly, John chose the monastery. He wanted to go to a place where no one knew him. He wanted to go to a place where there was no thing that would be to his benefit. And as soon as John arrived, the head guy was indeed found to live up and into his reputation. He was found to be resentful and mean. A sick monk was to him a nuisance and a needless drain on resources. And what's more, he came to know that John of the Cross was well known, and he resented him, jealousy perhaps. And so he treated John poorly and hatefully, and as a result, no surprise, John's illness grew worse and worse, more and more painful. And those who were there and told the story of John's time said that John of the Cross did not a single time speak poorly of the mean man in charge. In fact, John once wrote, "Never, dear ones, listen to any talk about the weaknesses of others. And if someone complains of another, in your presence, humbly ask that one not to speak that way to you." Never listen to talk about the weaknesses of others. The day of his death, John of the Cross knew he was close to the end. And he called for the head guy, the superior, to please, if he had the time, to come to his bedside. And when the angry man arrived, with all that he could muster and exquisite sincerity, John of the Cross begged his tormentors forgiveness. "Forgive me," he said, "if you can, for all the trouble that I have caused you and your monastery." And upon experiencing in John's apology the depth dimension of generosity and humility, the mean man broke down. In an instant, as the story goes, he fell to his knees at John's bedside, and through a torrent of tears, he begged John's forgiveness. And he left John's cell that day, tears still pouring from his eyes, a totally changed, a transformed man. And this was the final act. This was the final act of John of the Cross's Reformation work. A hard man, a mean man, a hurtful man was softened and changed into a kind man by John's humble act of love. John then asked the monks in that place, who by this time had come into his room and gathered round his bed, to read from the Song of Songs. And he died peacefully that night without struggle, while repeating the words, "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit," over and over again until he slipped away. And there was nothing in it for him. There was no thing. There was nothing. There was no thing in it for John. He was an instrument of God's love, plain and simple, with little, if any, thought of what reward might come from his work. And hear me say this. It was not a call to solitude. God's call on John's life, God's call on your lives, on my lives, it's not a call to solitude. In fact, as John of the Cross let go of attachments, the things and rewards of this life, he found that he was thrust by God. He was thrust by God into the lives of everyone around him. He was pushed and pressed and thrust by God into the streets. He saw little children and stopped to teach them how to read. They say when John of the Cross walked, they say he had a great sense of humor. It's my favorite detail other than dog. They say he had a great sense of humor. He loved to walk into a room and do all he could to make people laugh, and he oozed humility. John of the Cross once said, where you find there is no love, put love there, and thus you will draw love out. The humble, he continued, are those who hide in their own nothingness and know how to abandon themselves to God. Having let go, abandoning himself to God, John was served the bread of life. And the bread that John ate was God's love. And he abandoned himself to that love, and God turned him loose to help other people. It's never a call to solitude and to perching in high places. It's a call down here to the street level, which is where John found there is something in it for you. There is the simple, pure joy of being used by God for the purpose of love. And that is everything. It's all the things gathered into one. Love. Amen.